What if the most dangerous moment in a war is not when the bombs fall, but when victory is declared too early? What if the real story is not the damage done to Iran, but the quiet panic spreading through oil markets, allied capitals, and the White House itself? What if the strongest military machine on earth has already won the first round, yet still cannot close the fight on its own terms? Stay with me, because this is where the headlines stop being theater and start becoming a warning. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and support the work. That support helps us keep going, keep digging, and keep bringing you the kind of sharp, serious analysis this moment demands. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. Donald Trump wants the country to accept two ideas at once. He wants Americans to believe that Iran has already been broken hard enough that the outcome is no longer in doubt. And he wants them to accept that the United States still needs other countries to send ships to help finish the job. That is not a minor inconsistency. That is the core contradiction at the center of this war. Trump's language has been clear. Iran is decimated. Its military has been shattered. Its ability to rebuild, he says, may take 10 years or more. He says the war will be over pretty quick. He says oil prices will tumble as soon as it ends. That message is designed for political effect. It tells American voters that strength is working, that the operation is under control, and that the economic pain will pass soon. But reality does not bend to slogans. If Iran has already been defeated in any meaningful strategic sense, then why is the Strait of Hormuz still under pressure? Why is global shipping still disrupted? Why are oil markets still nervous? Why is the White House talking to 7 countries about warships, minesweepers, drones, and coalition support? Why is Trump warning NATO, pressing Britain, naming Japan and South Korea, and trying to pull China into the equation? A president does not build a maritime coalition when the enemy is finished. He does that when the battlefield has shifted and the end of the war is no longer fully under his control. That is the deeper truth here. Trump may have won the opening military phase. The United States and Israel have demonstrated overwhelming strike power. They have hit targets, damaged infrastructure, and shaken Tehran's military posture. But modern war is not judged by how fast you can destroy. It is judged by whether you can impose a stable political outcome at an acceptable cost. That is where the White House case starts to weaken. Because the real question is no longer whether Washington can hit Iran. It can. The real question is whether Washington can control the consequences of what it started. Can it reopen Hormuz? Can it calm oil markets? Can it keep allies aligned? Can it pressure Iran without triggering wider economic damage? Can it end this conflict before the system around it begins to break in ways no press conference can contain? That is where the structure of power becomes visible. Military force can destroy targets. It cannot by itself restore confidence. Markets do not care about victory speeches. Allies do not mobilize because of presidential certainty alone. Shipping insurers do not lower risk because Washington says the war is almost over. Systems move on trust, incentives, and credible control. Right now, that control looks incomplete. And that is why this contradiction matters so much. Trump is trying to project total dominance while quietly admitting dependence. He is trying to sell closure while expanding the mission. He is trying to look like the man ending the war even as the architecture of escalation is still growing around him. For American families, this is not abstract. This is about gas prices, inflation pressure, retirement anxiety, and the old fear that Washington once again knows how to start a war faster than it knows how to end one. That is the danger now. Not that the United States is weak, but that it may be strong enough to win the first phase and still lose control of the outcome. Hormuz is the real battlefield: oil, choke points, and the economics of power. The real battlefield in this war is not only in Tehran, not only in the skies over Iran, and not only in the strike maps shown in military briefings. The real battlefield is the Strait of Hormuz. That is where military pressure turns into economic shock. That is where geography becomes leverage. And that is where Iran, even after taking severe damage, still holds a weapon powerful enough to shake the entire international system. Most people hear the phrase Strait of Hormuz and think of a distant waterway. That is a mistake. Hormuz is not distant in any meaningful economic sense. It sits at the heart of the modern energy system. Roughly 1/5 of the world's traded oil moves through that narrow corridor, along with major volumes of liquefied natural gas. When that passage is disrupted, the result is not regional inconvenience. It is global stress. It hits shipping, insurance, refining, freight, inflation expectations, and political confidence all at once. That is why Hormuz matters more than any triumphant statement coming out of Washington. President Donald Trump can describe Iran as weakened. He can say the war will end soon. But as long as Hormuz remains under pressure, Iran still possesses a form of strategic power that goes far beyond missiles and drones. It has the power to inject fear into the bloodstream of the global economy. This is the brutal logic of choke points. In world politics, control over flow often matters more than control over land. A narrow passage can become more valuable than a large territory because it concentrates dependency. The world does not need every tanker to stop for a crisis to begin. It only needs enough uncertainty for shipowners to hesitate, insurers to raise premiums, traders to price in delay, and governments to start worrying about energy security. Markets move before physical shortages fully arrive. Fear itself becomes a financial event. That is exactly what we are seeing. Brent crude has moved above $100 a barrel and at points pushed beyond $106. Investors in Asia have turned cautious. Regional equity markets have shown strain. Tankers have been stranded or delayed. Traffic has collapsed from normal levels. Even where some passage remains possible, the system is already damaged because trust has broken down. And once trust breaks in an energy corridor, the cost does not stay on the water. It moves into supply chains, transportation, industrial production, food distribution, and consumer psychology. This is where economic theory matters. The price of oil is not determined only by how many barrels are physically lost today. It is shaped by expectations about future availability, by the durability of disruption, and by the credibility of any promise that order will soon return. That means a government can release emergency reserves, and the International Energy Agency has done exactly that on a massive scale, but reserves cannot fully repair the deeper problem. They can soften panic for a period. They cannot restore maritime confidence. They cannot convince the market that the choke point is under control if the underlying security picture remains unstable. Iran understands this with cold clarity. Tehran does not need to defeat the United States in a conventional military sense. It does not need to sink fleets or destroy entire export systems. It only needs to keep the cost of certainty high. It only needs to prove that the war cannot be contained neatly. That is enough to turn a military campaign into a macroeconomic problem, and a macroeconomic problem into a political liability for every government exposed to rising energy prices. For Americans, this is not abstract. Hormuz reaches into the daily life of the United States through fuel prices, freight costs, inflation pressure, and financial volatility. A war in the Gulf can become a tax on working families in Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania without a single missile ever landing on U.S. soil. That is the hidden force of systemic disruption. It travels through price signals, not troop movements. So when we say Hormuz is the real battlefield, we are saying something larger than a naval fact. We are saying this is where the war stops being a question of tactical power and becomes a test of economic order. And in that kind of fight, even a wounded state can still threaten a stronger one if it stands at the right pressure point in the system. Trump's coalition gambit, internationalizing the burden without owning the war. Donald Trump's push for a multinational naval effort in the Strait of Hormuz is not just a security plan. It is a political strategy, an economic shield, and a narrative rescue operation rolled into one. At first glance, the idea sounds simple: countries that depend on Gulf energy should help protect the route that carries it. But beneath that message is a much harder truth. The White House is trying to spread the burden of a war whose consequences are growing faster than its original script. This matters because the administration now faces a structural problem. The United States can strike, punish, and project force. What it cannot do as easily is absorb every downstream cost alone. The longer Hormuz remains unstable, the more the war stops looking like a clean demonstration of American strength and starts looking like an open-ended drain on global confidence. That is why Donald Trump is reaching outward. He is not simply asking for allied ships. He is trying to convert an American-led escalation into an international responsibility. That is the real meaning of the coalition push. In Washington's preferred framing, this is about fairness. Trump argues that the United States should not be expected to carry the full military burden of protecting oil flows that benefit Europe and Asia at least as much, and in some cases more, than America itself. That message is politically effective inside the United States. It taps into a deep frustration in American public life, the belief that America pays the security bill while others enjoy the economic upside. Trump understands that instinct better than most politicians, and he is using it here with precision. But fairness is only one layer. The deeper objective is ownership. If other countries join a Hormuz mission, then the crisis no longer belongs to Washington alone. The White House can say this is not the consequence of one president's war management. It becomes a wider defense of global commerce, shared by multiple governments. That changes the political optics immediately. It lowers the appearance of unilateralism. It spreads risk. And just as importantly, it spreads blame if things go wrong. That is why coalition politics matters so much in modern war. A coalition is never only about extra ships or added firepower. It is also about legitimacy. It tells markets that the burden of restoring order is broad enough to be sustainable. It tells adversaries that resistance will not divide the major powers that rely on the system. And it tells domestic audiences that the United States is still capable of leading, not merely reacting. In that sense, Trump is not just seeking naval support. He is trying to prove that American power can still organize the international environment around itself. The problem is that coalition building is harder than public pressure makes it seem. Strong rhetoric can get attention, but it cannot manufacture trust. Other governments are not asking only whether Hormuz matters. They are asking where this mission ends, what legal basis it rests on, what risks it creates, and whether Donald Trump himself has a fixed strategy or simply a rising list of demands. Those questions are especially important because the administration is trying to secure political commitment before operational clarity fully exists. That is a dangerous sequence. It suggests the White House wants the symbolism of Allied support now, while the actual mechanics of the mission can be figured out later. That may work for a press cycle. It is a weak foundation for real alliance management. There is also a more uncomfortable layer beneath the coalition gambit. Some foreign capitals may quietly believe that Washington is now trying to internationalize the cleanup after setting off a chain reaction it cannot fully control. That perception does not mean those governments support Iran. It means they do not automatically accept the White House claim that joining the mission is the same thing as defending neutral order. In politics, timing matters. When a coalition is built after escalation rather than before it, partners naturally ask whether they are being invited into a strategy or into a liability. This is where Trump's style becomes both an asset and a problem. His bluntness gives him leverage at home. It allows him to say to Americans, "Why should we defend the energy lifeline of countries that refuse to step forward?" But the same style can create resistance abroad. Allies do not like being publicly cornered into military commitments, especially when the lead power appears to be redefining the mission in real time. Pressure can create motion. It does not automatically create loyalty. So the coalition gamble tells us something profound about where this war stands. Donald Trump is no longer trying only to defeat Iran in the field. He is trying to redistribute the costs of what comes after. And that is always the moment when a war begins to reveal its true price. Why the Allies are hesitating: law, risk, and the fear of inheriting America's endgame. The hesitation coming from America's allies is not a side note in this story. It is one of the clearest signals that the war has entered a more dangerous phase. When partners hesitate at the exact moment Washington is asking for visible support, that usually means one thing: they are no longer debating whether the threat is real. They are debating whether the strategy coming out of the White House is stable enough to join. That distinction matters. Japan, Australia, Germany, Britain, France, and the European Union all understand the significance of the Strait of Hormuz. None of them are confused about what happens when a choke point this important comes under sustained pressure. They know the stakes are economic, military, and political. They know energy prices can move faster than diplomacy. They know shipping disruption can turn into inflation, recession risk, and public anger. Their caution is not a sign that they do not grasp the danger. It is a sign that they do. What they are not yet convinced of is something more fundamental: whether Donald Trump has defined an endgame they can trust. Take Japan first. Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi is not operating in a vacuum. She leads a state whose dependence on stable maritime trade is obvious, but she also leads within a legal and constitutional framework that was built to prevent exactly the kind of easy military drift that often follows crises. That matters because Washington tends to speak in strategic imperatives, while Tokyo has to think in legal limits, parliamentary scrutiny, and historical memory. So when Japan says it is examining what it can do within the law, that is not evasive language. That is the language of a government refusing to be pushed into a mission before it understands the legal and political cost. Australia's answer is even more revealing because it is so direct. Canberra has effectively said no. Not because the issue is trivial, and not because the alliance with the United States is weak, but because Australia understands something Washington does not always admit in public: once a naval mission begins in a theater this volatile, control becomes slippery. A ship sent for escort duty can end up in a retaliatory cycle faster than any press secretary can explain it. In war, limited commitments often become moral commitments, then military commitments, then political traps. Germany is voicing a different kind of concern, and it may be the most intellectually serious of the group. Johann Wadefuhl is not simply saying Europe should stay back. He is questioning whether the instruments on the table are even equal to the task. That is an important warning. Great powers often assume that willpower can compensate for weak design. It cannot. If the existing European maritime mission is already under strain, then expanding ambitions without proven capacity is not courage. It is theater. And theater at sea can get people killed. The European Union faces an even deeper structural problem. It is not one country. It is a political mechanism that moves by consensus, especially on security matters of this sensitivity. Any serious change to the mission of ASPIDES would require broad agreement among 27 member states, and that is not a technical detail. It is the heart of the matter. The European Union cannot move at the speed of Donald Trump's rhetoric, because it is not built to. It is built to absorb competing national fears, legal frameworks, economic exposures, and domestic political pressures before it acts. That makes it slow, frustrating, and sometimes ineffective. It also makes it less likely to walk blindly into someone else's escalation ladder. Britain and France are trying to hold a middle position. They do not want to look passive. They do not want to abandon the principle of freedom of navigation. But they also do not want to inherit a mission whose boundaries are not fully defined. Keir Starmer may talk about the importance of restoring shipping. France may explore options for a future effort when conditions allow. But those phrases are doing a lot of work. They are diplomatic ways of saying, not like this, not yet, not without more clarity. And that is the real message behind Allied hesitation. America's partners do not only fear Iran. They fear becoming trapped inside Washington's unfinished logic. They fear a mission that begins as escort duty and ends as open-ended confrontation. They fear joining a strategy whose military opening is clear but whose political ending is not. In the end, this is not about Allied weakness. It is about Allied memory. They have seen what happens when American power moves faster than American planning. And this time, many of them are refusing to board the ship until they know where it is actually going. China, summit leverage, and the limits of Trump's pressure politics. China is where this war stops being only a Middle East crisis and starts looking like a test of American leverage in a changing world. Donald Trump is not just asking Beijing to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. He is trying to force China to prove that a country that benefits from the global system must also pay to defend it. That sounds tough, even fair, to many Americans. But this is where Trump's pressure politics runs into the hard limits of power. The pressure campaign is built on a simple idea. Trump says China gets a huge share of its oil through Hormuz, far more than the United States does, so Beijing should stop free-riding and start helping. Then he raises the stakes. He signals that his planned summit with Xi Jinping in Beijing could be delayed if China does not engage. That is not just diplomacy. That is strategic coercion. It is Trump trying to use access, timing, and prestige as bargaining chips in a much larger contest over who carries the cost of order. On paper, the move has logic. China does depend on stable global energy flows. China does benefit from sea lanes that the United States has spent decades helping secure. And China has often preferred the comfort of commercial gain without the burden of frontline enforcement. Trump is tapping into a real American frustration here. Why should the United States keep paying, patrolling, and bleeding while rival powers continue to profit from stability they did not build? But pressure only works when the other side feels trapped. Beijing does not look trapped. It looks patient. That is the first thing Washington must understand. China is not reacting to this crisis from a position of panic. It has spent years building insulation into its energy model. It has diversified suppliers. It has expanded strategic reserves. It has invested heavily in infrastructure, storage, and alternative energy capacity. And even amid this conflict, Iranian oil has continued flowing toward China through channels that have not fully collapsed. That does not make Beijing immune. It does make it harder to intimidate than Trump suggests. This is where the structure of power really matters. Trump is treating dependency as if it automatically creates obedience. But in great power politics, dependency can also create bargaining space. China may need stable energy, but it does not need to secure that stability on America's terms. In fact, Beijing has strong reasons not to. Sending naval assets into a U.S.-defined coalition would mean accepting Washington's framing of the crisis. It would mean validating American leadership at the exact moment China would rather expose its limits. And there is something even more important happening beneath the surface. While Trump is publicly pressuring Beijing over Hormuz, U.S. and Chinese officials are still talking in Paris about agriculture, managed trade, critical minerals, and investment mechanisms that could shape the summit with Xi Jinping. That tells us this is not one issue. It is a layered negotiation. Trade, security, prestige, and strategic signaling are all being folded into the same contest. Trump is trying to use the Hormuz crisis to strengthen his hand before Beijing. China is trying to keep the tracks separate enough to preserve its room to maneuver. That is why Trump's threat to delay the summit may have more theatrical value than coercive value. It creates headlines. It signals toughness to domestic audiences. It tells voters that he is willing to challenge Beijing directly. But threats only go so far when the target believes time may be on its side. China can wait. China can hedge. China can publicly call for stability while privately calculating that every extra day of disorder exposes the cost of American overreach. There is also a deeper historical twist here. China's long bet on batteries, solar, electric vehicles, and broader energy diversification now gives it a form of strategic patience the United States cannot easily match in a hydrocarbon shock. The more the world fears choke points like Hormuz, the more valuable China's alternative energy position becomes. That means this crisis may not just test American strength. It may quietly increase Chinese leverage. That is the limit of Trump's pressure politics. He is trying to turn Chinese exposure into submission. But Beijing is not an ally waiting for instruction. It is a rival power studying how much strain this war puts on American leadership. And the harder Trump pushes, the more he reveals the truth he does not want to admit: the United States can still threaten, still punish, still dominate militarily, but it can no longer assume that economic dependence will automatically produce strategic compliance. Kharg Island and the escalation ladder, when economic war becomes ground war. Kharg Island is where this war stops being a campaign of pressure and starts flirting with something far more dangerous: occupation logic. That is why the name matters. It is not just another target on a military map. It is one of the most sensitive economic organs in the Iranian system. Roughly 90% of Iran's crude exports typically move through Kharg Island. In plain English, that means this is not just infrastructure. It is cash flow. It is regime oxygen. It is the bridge between Iran's battered state power and the money that keeps that power alive. That is exactly why Kharg Island is so tempting to Donald Trump and the hawks around him. If the Strait of Hormuz is Iran's way of hurting the global economy, then Kharg Island looks like Washington's chance to hit back at the regime's financial nerve center. The theory is simple and ruthless: do not just punish Iran's military, cut the revenue stream that funds its staying power. That is how economic war begins to merge with military escalation. On the surface, that logic looks compelling. It has a clean strategic elegance to it. If Tehran is trying to raise the cost of war for everyone else, then strike the one place that makes prolonged resistance economically possible. Put enough pressure on the regime's export machine, and maybe its leaders will recalculate. Maybe the balance inside Tehran shifts. Maybe the cost of defiance becomes too high. In war rooms, that kind of argument is always attractive because it promises a shortcut. It suggests that one decisive move can achieve what weeks of pressure have not. But this is where war becomes most deceptive. Because there is a massive difference between damaging Kharg Island and controlling it. Airstrikes destroy. Seizure requires presence. Presence requires troops. Troops require logistics, force protection, extraction plans, political patience, and a willingness to absorb casualties when things go wrong. That is the point where a war sold as a hard, limited campaign begins to mutate into something else. And that mutation matters because it changes the structure of the conflict. Once the United States moves from punishing an adversary's assets to physically taking possession of them, it is no longer just trying to shape behavior from a distance. It is taking direct responsibility for holding a strategic node inside a live war zone. That is not a symbolic escalation. That is a new phase of war. At that moment, Kharg Island would stop being a pressure point and become a liability Washington must defend every hour of every day. This is how escalation ladders work in real life. Leaders do not usually leap straight into the most dangerous option. They climb toward it one argument at a time. First, limited strikes. Then broader target sets. Then strategic infrastructure. Then the claim that a more forceful move is needed because the last one did not change behavior. Every step sounds rational in isolation. Every step can be explained as necessary. But taken together, they lead a country into a war far larger than the one it originally described to the public. Kharg Island is that kind of step. And the risks are not abstract. If Washington goes further there, Tehran could retaliate across the Gulf against oil facilities, pipelines, shipping nodes, or partner states such as Saudi Arabia. Markets would not see that as controlled escalation. They would see it as systemic danger. Prices could spike again. Insurance costs could surge. Investors could read the move as proof that the war is expanding faster than diplomacy can contain it. And for American families, that means the distance between a military decision in the Gulf and economic pain at home becomes even shorter. There is also a human truth here that should never be buried under strategic language. Once you talk seriously about taking and holding territory, you are talking about Americans in harm's way. Not in the abstract. Not as symbols. As sons, daughters, husbands, wives, and parents sent into the most unforgiving part of a conflict that was originally presented as limited and manageable. That is why Kharg Island is such a revealing test. It shows whether Donald Trump is still trying to end this war, or whether the war is beginning to pull him toward a larger one. Because a president who says the enemy is already broken should not need options that look this much like the opening chapter of a deeper regional entanglement. And if he does, then the real story is no longer how much damage has been done. The real story is how much further this conflict may still go. The endgame problem, winning the opening rounds, losing control of the outcome. The final test of power is not whether a president can start a war with force. It is whether he can end it without losing control of everything the war sets in motion. That is the endgame problem now staring Donald Trump in the face. The opening rounds of this conflict gave him what every White House wants in the first days of war: visible action, clear targets, dramatic damage, and the appearance of momentum. But momentum is not the same as mastery. And mastery is what history remembers. That is the trap. In the early phase of war, military superiority can create a dangerous illusion. It can make leaders believe that because they control the tempo of strikes, they also control the direction of the conflict. But wars are not finished when the stronger side proves it can hit harder. Wars become politically real when the second-order effects begin to spread through markets, alliances, domestic politics, and enemy adaptation. That is where this conflict now lives. Trump has shown that the United States can impose pain on Iran. No serious observer can deny that. But the central strategic questions remain unsettled. Iran is damaged, yet not politically broken. The regime is under pressure, yet it has not accepted Washington's terms. The global oil system is strained, yet not stabilized. America's allies are alarmed, yet not fully aligned. China is watching, calculating, and resisting pressure without openly confronting it. That is not what a finished war looks like. That is what an unfinished strategic contest looks like. And unfinished contests are where presidents get pulled into their most dangerous mistakes. The endgame problem is always harder than the opening move because it forces a leader to answer questions that cannot be bombed away. What is the acceptable final state? What level of risk is still tolerable? How much economic pain can the public absorb? How long will allies stay close if the mission keeps expanding? How many new threats are created by every attempt to shut down the old ones? These are not side questions. These are the questions that decide whether a war remains limited or becomes a long political wound. That is why this moment should feel familiar to Americans, even if the geography is different. The deepest scars left by Iraq and Afghanistan were not created by the first demonstrations of U.S. power. They were created by the slow realization that no one had defined an end state the country could actually secure at a reasonable cost. The public was told that strength would settle the matter. Instead, strength opened a larger cycle of exposure, confusion, and drift. That memory matters now because it raises the bar for any administration claiming that this war will be quick, controlled, and clean. Trump's political problem is that the American people do not live inside military briefings. They live inside prices, paychecks, anxieties, and trust. They want to know whether their leaders are acting from strategic discipline or from improvisation disguised as confidence. They want to know whether this war has a conclusion or only a series of next steps. They want to know whether the language of victory is backed by a real path to closure. And that brings us to the hardest truth in this entire story. A president can win the opening rounds and still lose control of the outcome. He can dominate the battlefield and still fail to stabilize the system around it. He can weaken an enemy and still strengthen the forces of disorder. He can look strong in the short term while quietly making the long-term crisis harder to contain. So the answer to the larger question is now unavoidable. If Donald Trump still needs foreign ships, reluctant allies, pressure on China, and possible new escalation paths to bring this war to a close, then he has not yet won the part that matters most. He has proven power. He has not yet proven control. And in modern geopolitics, control is everything. Because the real measure of leadership is not whether you can break the old order. It is whether you can prevent the crisis you unleashed from building a far more dangerous one in its place. So here is the deeper truth behind this entire story. Donald Trump may have won the opening rounds of the Iran war in the narrow military sense. He showed force, speed, and the ability to hit hard. But this story was never only about bombs, targets, or battlefield claims. It became a much bigger test of whether power can actually control consequences. That is where the real struggle began. The Strait of Hormuz turned into the true center of gravity. Oil prices became a political weapon. Allies began to hesitate. China became harder to pressure than expected. And Kharg Island emerged as a symbol of how quickly a limited war can slide towards something far more dangerous. In the end, the character at the center of this story is not just a president trying to look strong. It is a leader confronting the oldest trap in geopolitics. It is much easier to break a system than to rebuild order after the shock. Trump's challenge was never simply defeating Iran's military capacity. His real challenge was proving that American power could shape the aftermath, calm markets, hold alliances together, and avoid turning escalation into entanglement. That is why this story matters so much. It is not just about one war. It is about the difference between force and control, between spectacle and strategy, between declaring victory and actually securing peace. And the deeper lesson for all of us is powerful. In life, as in politics, strength is not proven by how fast you react. It is proven by how well you manage consequences. Anyone can make a bold move in a moment of anger, fear, or pride. But real wisdom means thinking 3 steps ahead, understanding the system around you, and knowing that every action creates a chain of outcomes. In your own life, that means do not judge decisions only by short-term success. Ask what they will cost later. Ask whether today's win creates tomorrow's crisis. That is how discipline, leadership, and maturity are built. Now here is a quick question for you. Which matters more in a conflict like this? A. Winning the first strikes. B. Controlling the outcome after the strikes. Comment A or B below. And what do you think about Trump's strategy in this crisis? Was it real strength, or did it expose the limits of American power? Share your view in the comments so everyone can learn from different perspectives. And if you value sharp, serious analysis like this, subscribe to the channel and support the work. That support helps keep this channel going and gives us the energy to bring you more strong content in the next videos.